based on a previous discussion we had off camera, which based on how much we've already spoken, you can imagine happens often, we were discussing humanity, and I did tell my father that I figured I could make him human-ish, but human-er was way more likely. So I made him promise he would let me lead this one. So we were discussing the fact that during his prep time, his gameplay, people do not believe how much time he spends on D&D or why. So I think I'll start by just making the point that I see him play and schedule and run D&D probably about 16 hours a week just based on his blog. And not counting the fifth man, how much time are you actually spending on D&D a week?
I right now, because I've been doing a lot of other things, not that much, but on average, when all things are right and I'm in the zone, anywhere between 40 and 80 hours a week. I've had certain jobs at certain times where I'm able to sit at my job and having had everything else tidied up and ready, I've been able to spend 6 to 7 hours in an 8 hour day sitting at my desk doing nothing but D&D because, well, I don't really care that they're paying me as long as I'm getting the job done. So, and I've been happy. People have been happy with the job that I've done. So,
Just thinking out of context, it sounds insane. And I've told people how much time you spend on D&D, and I've seen the guys online who are concerned about you. And we've made jokes about medication, but I don't think it would work. And but I have to give a kind of perspective from a small business attitude. So I've run a small business for myself before, and the idea of spending between 60 and 80 hours a week on a small business is completely realistic. On average, a hat maker, which I am, just to make a hat a day, a truly impressive hat, is 6 hours of good, hard work. And that's generally what the professionals take to do. So if you want to make a living, which you will just barely do, you have to think, I'm going to work 60 to 80 hours a week. The 40-hour work week perception is very easy when all I have to do is be a cashier or take phone calls or anything like that, because you walk away, you wipe your hands off, and you're done with it. Between the blog, him running our game, him running his additional game, and anything else he happens to be doing, when you think of how much managing, prep, etc. is expected, how could you not take between 60 and 80 hours a week?
well, most people would say that that's way too much. They look at my world, they look at their own worlds, and they say, I have no desire to run a world like that where I have to work that much. I feel that I should be able to sit and play D&D from the same perspective as the players. I shouldn't have to do anything upon walking in the door, laying out my books, opening the event that I've maybe purchased or maybe have from a previous game that I set up years ago, opening up that event and playing. I shouldn't have to spend more than 4 hours a week running my game, and that's it. I shouldn't have to have prep time.
And yet, naturally, so often I see games that are terrible because we have to keep stopping. I think prep is everything. Most games require that kind of prep. And part of the reason I often failed as a DM in my younger years was the unwillingness to complete that kind of prep. Now, would I compare my prep with yours? Absolutely not. But I'm only running one game at a time with significantly less players because I understand my limitation if
Okay,
I'm not
but
willing to make more time.
let's not cast let's not cast me in a light that doesn't happen. My game stops all the time. I have something that I need to do or something that I need to set up. The players do something that's unexpected, and I say, I don't know what to do right now, or I'm going to go take a little bit of a walk, or I'm going to step over here, and you guys talk among yourselves, or I'm drawing some bear for the combat that's about to happen, and you guys are all sitting around for 10 minutes watching me draw a bear before we actually get into the combat. So it's not as though my game doesn't stop for prep in the middle of the game.
I expect it, and I do. But I think there's a difference between, all right, we've done something strange and the DM needs to recalculate or draw a bear or anything like that, versus he hasn't even rolled up any monsters tonight. He had no plan, and we're just blindly faking through the darkness. I've seen DMs cook up a running. I've seen you cook up a running, and you've said, okay, we've avoided the anthill that I'd worked out, so we're going to have to move along. And I had kind of an idea what the next thing was, but I'm going to need to take 10 minutes. Any player needs breaks as much as the DM does, and when it's adequate prep for in-game play, the break is needed. If it's prep constantly because you didn't prepare, it is unbearable because I can't invest, and neither can anyone else who's playing. And I think in turn, if I'm not investing, the DM is not investing.
Okay, but if I am drawing lines out on a board to show you the room that you're walking into because I didn't draw those lines out an hour before the game started, are you calling that, are you counting that as prep or not prep?
I would call that, I guess in context, I would call that prep, but only in the sense that you at least knew you randomly rolled, say you rolled up an anthill and now you have to quickly make up an anthill. I'm invested while you're drawing. And there is a bit of that as long as you're continuing to involve me. Here are the lines, this is what the room looks like, etc., etc. That's very different from you need to stop and create a lot of characters and draw a room and not talk to me while everybody else gets off topic and goes down the merry little road because we're not paying attention. We're not investing.
So I think it's easier because I'm not making you guys shut up while I'm doing this.
Well, and you're not shutting up. That's a big part of it. You're kind of talking your way through whatever we need to see. Arguably, you're working on stuff we're not seeing, but you're describing a little as you throw stuff out. You're describing the dungeon opening while you're making the bear. You're keeping people engaged.
Okay, well, I've often said on the blog that 19 parts out of 20, I mean, not exactly in those terms, but I would say 19 parts out of 20 are not preparation for a specific event. At least 95% of my game is just general world building, just a general sense of having the whole world backdrop controlled or developed to a certain degree so that in the moment of the game, if I need to come up with something on the spur of the moment, I have a really good sense of what the government in this town is like, what the people here are like, what their motivations would be, why would they want to do something, so that if I am dreaming something up on the spur of the moment, I have more to draw on than this is a road and there are trees next to it. I really need more than that in order to have something to cook up on the spur of the moment. And I think the more that you understand your world, the easier it is to cook something up.
I often think this is why less people who are not as experienced find it so easy to play in a Middle Earth or a Greyhawk or something like that, just because it gives you a kind of a context of the world that you can extrapolate from and then create on top of that. And I mean, maybe that works for you. I've certainly found many holes in those kind of systems. But having something to draw from is everything. And you're putting in the 80 hours a week with the intent of giving yourself something to draw from.
I did do a world once upon a time that was completely created from scratch. Every town, every coastline, every landmass, everything was created from scratch. It would have looked something like a Greyhawk world. It was a sort of a circle of land around an inner sea, and it would have covered an area about the size of the United States. And I ran that for about 4 years. But the problem I had with that, and this is also something that the Middle Earth world solves, but I don't know if the Greyhawk world solves. I suppose it depends on how much reading you do about Greyhawk. But I found that the players just saw every town being precisely the same. Every plain was the same. Every coast was the same. Every sea was the same. They had no reference point for any of these things, so they weren't bringing to the table any concept. And there's only so much you can really describe in a town to make, port this different from this place over here or this river port or something like
You
this.
keep running into the adequate tavern. Every town has a tavern.
Yeah,
Every town has
It might
a
as well
tavern.
be the Hilton Tavern, where every room looks exactly the same, and people talk about they wake up in the Hilton, they travel a lot, and they wake up in the Hilton, and they have to find a newspaper or something to find what city they're in because they've forgotten where they landed last night. Yeah, I think that's a real problem with people who are trying to make worlds that are completely from scratch, because not enough time can be taken to make those places really, really different. And I think the more you you spend trying to go all in to make them different, the more gimmicky and difficult to relate your world becomes. I'm thinking of games where they've tried to invent an environment which is so odd, so off the wall, with so many cultural references built into the world that the players are like, I can't remember why I'm wearing blue right now. Can somebody remind me why my character has to wear blue and not green? Because green means something that blue doesn't mean.
Isn't there a bunch of stuff like that in the one with the weird rabbits? What is that?
You're talking about Gamma World?
Gamma World. Gamma World has some weird stuff like that.
There's lots of people sit down to say, I think Masquerade really suffers for that sort of thing, is that you need to remember what all the clans are and what all the beliefs of all the different clans are, and what's right and what's wrong and this and so on. I think for people who want to make that a fetish, it becomes a big thing, but I think that for most players, it's why am I remembering or trying to remember all this stuff?
I had similar problems when I first ever played Alignment, because with the 50 million things I had to remember as a DM, alignment was not one I cared about. It was just too much crap to remember. And constantly, do I punish Jim because he's slightly out of alignment, but he's fairly high level, and will his god care? And it just became, unless it was completely, I'm slaughtering dwarves and pushing their corpses into a mine so that I can fill it with goo so that stones will rise to the top, I just didn't want to go there.
The world has to be something that is so familiar that the players feel like they're putting on a coat when they sit down at the table. It has to be something where they can predict what's going to happen if I do A or if I do B. And if the world becomes such a protocol madness that you're never sure what A or B is going to result in, then it becomes a thing where I kill everything that comes near me because I can't be bothered to figure out what I'm doing wrong.
This does make the Middle-earth world very appealing because of that. Because I know what the Shire looks like, I have a context of Rohirrans, etc. And that makes it very easy because it's translatable. And I think with your world, the things that make it functional is that it is based on Earth in a sort of deformed state. But it's still Russia, there's still a mountain there, etc., etc.
I think the problem with Middle-earth that I have, and I understand why it is an appeal, but I think because you're in Tolkien's head to some degree, you're in a straitjacket as a DM. The elves have to be a particular way. The dwarves have to be a particular way. Everybody has to relate to each other in a particular way. And again, for people who want to make that their fetish, that's fine. But it's hard if the DM wants to have an orc or an elf or something that behaves in a way that isn't wholly predictable. And once things become predictable, you lose a great deal of the stress and the drama and the strain on the party's decision-making process. And that's what really brings a lot of momentum to the game. Whatever your world is, the party's got to also feel like there are no rules about the way that the orc that is moving towards you on the road is going to act. Because if that orc is always going to act exactly like the book says, well, then we always know what to do.
I do like when things are unpredictable, and I promise not to do a lot of war stories, but this is relevant. We were recently playing a game with somebody who happens to roll freakishly well as a thief, and he managed unknowingly to sneak up on a djinn. For anyone who doesn't know what a djinn is, it's a kind of a genie-like creature, and it just happened to relate to where we were. Given the reaction, as a DM, you have a couple choices. You've shocked the djinn, you've surprised it, it rolled that it was surprised, and I know a million DMs that would react that you have snuck up on a djinn, it freaks out, it attacks you and beats you to a very gooey state, and well, we've all learned something about djinn. But a nice perspective was that the djinn did not kill us, it was impressed, and then it just spoke to us, and I think DMs are so inclined to make a monster that they forget that this wouldn't work. If you did that, then the whole world, you would never meet somebody that wasn't an adventurer. You would never meet somebody that wasn't just beating up monsters for money, because based on original game rules, anybody knows that you make very little money unless you're slaughtering monsters and hauling treasure out from underground. So there is kind of an attitude of you need it to be less particular.
Well, I think that it's also the fact that a lot of DMs would simply be unwilling to accept that a djinn could be surprised. There's no literature about djinn that are surprised, so the idea that it's even possible seems ludicrous. So on some level, the djinn shouldn't have to obey the same rules of being surprised as any other creature, and therefore you should be able to say, oh, no, you don't surprise the djinn, don't even roll, there's no possibility for it. And it is that kind of thing that makes such an inflexible system. And if you're going to world build, you don't want your system to become too inflexible. You want there to be room for the dice to make things happen that wouldn't normally happen or that aren't expected. That's really important.
I don't think it was your intention to have us sneak up on the djinn, and I don't think it was your intention to have it roll that way. But it felt comfortable, and sometimes it's about going with your gut.
And I had fun with it. I want to come back to this part about the 19 parts out of 20, because I think that putting all of the rest of the world on a shelf for a moment, I think that most DMs, when they sit down to try to create a world or a universe for themselves or for their players, they're thinking strictly in terms of adventure. If they're thinking about preparing the world ahead of time, they're thinking specifically of here's what I'm doing Saturday, here's the module, here's this framework. My players will want to do it because that's the kind of players that I have. So it's not a question of whether or not I'm railroading them, because my players can't wait to go into the dungeon and hack this dungeon to pieces. Therefore, all of my prep that I'm doing, none of it really is the world. And all Greyhawk, all I really need the Greyhawk map for is to be able to tell the difference or the distance between dungeons. You know, you're going 20 miles to the next dungeon, you're going 60 miles to the next dungeon, and that's all I really need a world for. And I think that the problem with that is by making the game so incremental, you're almost damning yourself to never being able to develop any kind of characterization for these people. All they do is move into dungeons and hack the dungeon. It's fun for people. I understand that some people only want the game that way, but I think it limits the game to the sort of thinking that says that all campaigns must run a couple of months until this dungeon is finished, and then let's all roll up a different character so that we can roll in another kind of dungeon. I don't have to play a mage next time. I don't have to play a thief next time, or a rogue, or whatever, because none of this really matters anyway. We're just going through this dungeon. And if that's the way that you're playing, then of course you're not going to see any rationale to building a bigger world that has bigger world ideas, because you're not interested in that wider meta game of what does my player do when, or what does my character do when we're not actually in a dungeon.
I make the argument for character evolution constantly with people, because I'll say to people, we've been playing for 10 years. I still have my first character. No, I have not retired it. I still play it. And they just don't understand, what on earth are you doing with this character except running around being overpowered? I naturally look at them and go, well, clearly you're not digging deep enough. In our game, we have a fundamental difference with henchmen. Unlike the original game where your henchman is more of a follower and you have no control over him, in our game you do have control over him, but of course he is that character's hench and he will work for that character and no one else, which naturally makes sense. When we started playing, we were cleaning out easy dungeons, we were weak, we were heavy magic user based. We then evolved to having some henchmen. We could do things that were a little harder. Let's say we went from 5 to 9. As we've continued to evolve, we're looking at, between my personal group is about 30 people between followers and henchmen. And that allows for me to take on things that are much bigger, including the mass combat.
But don't you lose personality when you have 30 people? I mean, if you're running around, your personal character pile is your first ranger, and then your henchman after your ranger, and then your ranger's followers because you've hit 8th level. What is the personality of your ranger? How does that ranger's personality mean that you still like that ranger after 10 years?
I think it's really important about building a proper group. Anybody who picks characters has to think about that. I started with a ranger. I've often played a meat shield, and being one of the most experienced people at the table when we started playing, I know how to play a fighter without just being a meat shield. I understand my place. I know where to stand. I don't just run into combat. But it has the problem of I am still a hack and slash character. I followed up with an illusionist, which are challenging to play, but complements my ranger well. It can do range things my ranger cannot do, just as my ranger can defend it. And as I've built characters, and with the need to evolve them away from each other, I've played my illusionist separately as a single magic user because he was more effective. I've played my ranger separately.
But those are the things your characters can do. What about the characters themselves? I mean, the ranger's name is Phelan. What if Phelan dies?
I've had Phelan die once. It was
No, I mean forever.
forever would be really challenging. You get really committed to your characters. Not necessarily because you've made that choice, but just things have happened. You've had this character and you made some fantastic role. You have war stories built in your head and you just slowly become attached. It is your own special storybook. And if the character dies, you've lost the storybook. You've lost the ability to add to it. And you can only sort of reminisce. And that's important. If I don't care that it dies, I will push her into combat unthinkingly, and I will never give a damn, and she'll die, and I'll roll up another one, and eventually I will feel empty and unwilling to keep playing. I've not invested.
You remember that in the early years of the game, the media made a big thing of the fact that people thought that their characters were real people, and that if your character died, you had lost somebody so near and dear to you that you were going to go home, as some now apocryphal stories were told at the time. You would go home and execute yourself because, oh my God, my character is dead. I cannot carry on. Do you think that Phelan has a certain reality? Because I would argue that Phelan, in your mind, has a reality the same way that Dorothy has a reality in The Wizard of Oz. We care about Dorothy. We relate to Dorothy. We know what kind of person Dorothy is. For anybody who grew up with The Wizard of Oz being a significant book in their minds, Dorothy is an important character. People relate to the Cowardly Lion. They relate to, and to bring it back to the last podcast we did, they relate to Rogue or Gambit or any of the modern comparisons to Dorothy. So isn't Phelan just basically that for you?
Essentially, and I think the mistake that the media made was that it wasn't that someone like Phelan dies, which is a character I perceive outside of myself. It's people who are injecting themselves. I'm not playing Phelan, I'm playing me. And then that's a sign of severe issues, which naturally would cause problems. If I'm playing a character not thinking, this is me if I was really smart and beautiful and badass, which is what a lot of players do. They're imagining themselves as themselves in the game, and that's a sign of unusual. You would always imagine that you're trying to be a better version of yourself.
Well, I don't want to get too far off topic because we can do a podcast later about characters and running characters and how to play a character and so on. Right now, I want to concentrate on the design of the world. How does the world that I've been making, how does that enable your character to feel more like a created character within a, shall we say, a venue different from film or books or something that you might do on that level?
I've often said the mistake with 3 and onward was that it wanted the character to affect the environment. And that makes it challenging for a character to grow, and that makes it challenging for the world to grow as well. When the game is driven that the environment affects the character, that causes the character to exist. I've played environments with my henchman. He's an illusionist. I've been playing him for the last 8 years. He had very little personality. I was unsure what to do with him. But through several just environmental things, I've made some very close rolls with him. And mostly because he's been against a wall and he's had to survive. So it was like roll a 20. If he doesn't make it, this is the end for him. I did start this character with 4 hit points to make a clear understanding. When he made these rolls and survived, just because the environment forced him to, he became a character within himself, known for being forced to take an action of bravery and then surviving it.
Well, why doesn't that happen in every world? I mean, why doesn't it happen that any person running a character in another world, you're in the Tomb of Horrors, say, and your character almost dies? Isn't it just as natural that your character in that particular Tomb of Horrors also has now more character because they almost died?
You're not making that mental investment. You're going in already having written his story, already deciding what he is, so that when he makes save in an unknown predicament, you're going to relate it to the story you've created. You're not going to create a story based on the event. Human beings create stories based on things that happen to you. You don't make stories based on who you are and how you affected it.
So the world that I am making is creating value in your character because of the world itself. How am I doing that?
If your character has never seen snow and suddenly it snows, you're forced to think about how your character would react to snow. based on your wisdom, etc., etc.
Okay, but how am I doing it? Like as a DM, what am I doing right that encourages that kind of thing to happen?
You're choosing to make it snow. You're doing something unexpected or not necessarily something that always happens. If I suddenly fight a polar worm, that's going to completely change my way of
Isn't
thinking.
that the way everybody does it? I thought that's how everybody did it.
No, quite often people establish characters and then you're thrown into a very functional dungeon. And because dungeons tend to be very A-line and they tend to be very hack and slash, this does not create suddenly I'm underwater and I have to decide how my character feels about underwater. Most of the time I'm underwater and I'm fighting a giant crab. So I'm not thinking about how I'm reacting to underwater. I'm thinking about how I'm fighting a giant crab.
I can't even begin to understand that. I would assume that when we were all sitting down as young people and starting to make our world, and we were reading something like going back to when I was a young person, we were reading something like the Wilderness Adventure Guide, that when they said put snow in your campaign because people were going north, that for God's sake, people actually put snow in their campaign. And I find it difficult to believe that people are not designing their worlds to the point, or designing their games to the point where at least there's actually snow in a place where they're going to the north.
The problem is the snow has to be an enemy. It can't be an occurrence. It'll snow, but it'll be a blizzard and you'll all be freezing to death. And now you're reacting to dying. You're not reacting to, hey, it's snowing and we're going to have to move through the snow for the next 6 runnings.
Isn't that what they call fluff?
I say it's weakness. I like to view it as I don't want to hit you with another monster right now. So I will make an element monster. It's just an element problem. You're just fighting constantly. You're not getting engaged in the world. It doesn't just happen to snow. The snow has to be dangerous and deadly and horrible. It can't be you're experiencing a light dust. Welcome to the north. You're slightly colder here.
That's really strange to me. I mean, I do that sometimes. I do see a storm that way, but I'm more concerned with ensuring that if you're in a particular part of my world that the sun is hot, that it snows, that if you've gone from A to B. I mean, perhaps that is because I am running a world where so much of it is familiar. I mean, if you are in Paris or Iran or you're in China or some such, then I have a basis for saying, well, you're in South China, it's going to be hot, there's going to be lots of rice paddies, it's going to be wet, there are going to be lots of, snakes and so on and so forth. And that comes back to making the bigger world so that I can identify what should be floating around you as you're moving. But I'm still not sure how that actually makes a character simply because you have a background or a setting for your person to be in. I think for myself, when I was a character, I know I'm dominating this for a moment, but I'm thinking of when I did play games and I was a character, what I liked about being a character was that I always had some vast, tremendous plan that I was on course with. I needed to talk to this group of people, I needed to set that group of people up, and I was always building something and so on. But I haven't done that sort of thing in such a long time because I don't play anymore. And what I get out of being a character is not necessarily what other people get out of being a character.
I just hope I've made myself clear enough, which is probably about 5 sheets of mud. But that's what you get to when you get to these challenging conversations, is you run into stuff where this is what I'm getting out of it, this is what Mark is getting out of it, this is what Jim is getting out of it. It's always going to be something different.
You don't want Phelan to die, right?
Correct.
Okay, and you don't want me to say, I don't really want to run this world anymore. I think I'd like to run some other kind of a system. I have this plan for running Middle-earth, and I think that I'm going to put my world on a shelf and go run Middle-earth, and maybe we'll come back to this world someday. Everybody roll up a new character.
Oh, yes, you would have so many players in 62 years when everyone reinvested in you. I've had 10, I think everybody in my running, when we were like first and second level, we talked about conquering Romania because it felt realistic. It wasn't too big, but it was way too big for us at the time. As we grow as a group, as a mass, we probably amass 100 to 160 characters between characters, followers, hirelings, henchmen, etc. And we have said, gee, maybe we could conquer Romania. I mean, we just make a few friends and buy a few more catapults, and it gets dumber every year that we're getting just a little bit closer. And when we do conquer Romania, we'll make him post it on the blog. But
well, Romania is a lot bigger than people imagine. I mean, it's big.
Well, it's not Russia, which we're really close to. So you're like Russia, Romania. We could maybe take Romania.
I think it's more likely. Well, anyways. I think there are smaller kingdoms which you would have a much better chance of maybe dominating.
I did state not there yet.
Of course, I do intend to run for the next 40 years. So, maybe when I'm 80 and I'm crawling to the table and taking,
We're
4 or
propping him
5
up with
handfuls of
sticks.
pills as I'm being propped up with sticks, yeah, then maybe you could be taking Romania at that time. But okay, yes. This is what everybody does, though. Okay, this is what everybody else does. I mean, I'm constantly assailed online that no campaign runs for 10 years and characters don't care anyway, and people get bored of playing fighters. And I'm really bored with playing this world, and I'd like to go play Rifts for a while, or I'd really rather not run this same D&D campaign forever and ever. I'm so bored with it. So I don't know why I'm like this. I don't know why I'm invested in this one world, and I don't see any desire to run any other world. I don't know why another world would somehow make the game better for me. I don't know how my presentation would improve if I suddenly started running something else. Oh, well, apparently that's it for us then. I hope that she's been clear, and I hope that everybody understands that my daughter does not kowtow to me at all.
Not even a little.
See, there you go.
I told him he couldn't be humaner. I said humanish was possible. We're trying.
Yes.
He is not human. He is some D&D machine freak monster. But he does laugh and he does cry and he is programmed to feel pain.
I bleed. Look, I bleed.
My apologies through any podcast we do if I call him Alexi. I have a natural habit assuming that he calls himself Alexi online, that if I keep saying my dad, people are going to start to waver or become confused. So I do apologize. I'm corporately programmed.
Well, I hope we sound enough alike that people don't think I've hired an actor to play my daughter. But,
neurotic speech patterns.
all right. Thank you, everybody. We'll talk later. Oh, you signed on, so you should sign on.
Oh, well, then I'll just sign off then, and I'll try to click the button. You have a good night, guys.